Okay, so this is part 2 of Foner 21, the New Deal, and I'll be covering the limits of change in terms of how the New Deal affected some differently and less thoroughly than others, as well as new definitions of liberty, new conceptions of America. So first off, the New Deal and American women. American women had a mixed experience with the New Deal. On the one hand, there was more and more women in the federal government, such as Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor, Eleanor Roosevelt as the First Lady, who had very progressive political aims, for instance, for women and for blacks. But there was also a political decline of feminism during the 1920s and into the 1930s. Why? Women had achieved the vote after World War I. Thereafter, there was a great disagreement over what the next step was. Should there be complete equality for men and women in the laws, no special treatment for women at all? Or should one have laws that take into account women's particular roles, not particular roles, but the particular challenges that women face, for instance, being pregnant, having children, etc. Should the law in some fashion protect and support women when they are pregnant and then in the early years of child rearing? Women also faced a lot of resistance to women's employment during the New Deal. For instance, in the federal government, they refused to hire women or keep women keep women employed if their husband was employed by the federal government. State governments also passed laws barring the hiring of women if the husbands had a living wage. The idea was to get men working again, as well as the ingrained belief that women were supported by husbands anyway, and so they didn't deserve equal treatment in the workplace. In the labor movement, the CIO organized women, but they also believed that a woman whose husband is working should be barred from industry. And more generally in society, from the banks to public schools, married women with working husbands were barred from employment. And there was an uneven access to New Deal benefits. Social Security only applied to those working and paying taxes. This excluded most women who did not work outside the home, and excluded 3 million domestic workers in particular. For African Americans, the New Deal had varied consequences. On the one hand, there was an egalitarian current in the New Deal. Many blacks were appointed as advisors to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and various cabinet members focused attention on things like segregation, discrimination, and lynching. For instance, Eleanor Roosevelt and Harold Dix, the Secretary of the Interior. There was also a shift of black voters to the Democratic Party. In the North and West, where blacks could vote, they abandoned the Republican Party for the Democrats. But the New Deal preserved the existing racial order of white supremacy. FDR did not support anti-lynching laws, or did he challenge the exclusion of agricultural workers or domestic workers from Social Security and from the Wagner Acts. This were insisted upon by Southerners in Congress that Roosevelt needed to pass his laws in Congress. Also, blacks received dismal provisions from the New Deal. Blacks without any income were confined to getting the least generous provisions in the Social Security Act. There was also a stigma of welfare dependency, as benefits were based on paying taxes, and non-taxpayers, or the poor, were left with the least generous provisions. There was a stigma that developed of recipients being dependent on government handouts or welfare. Further hardships for blacks were last hired and first fired. And since many blacks were hired most recently, they were fired most immediately, and so black unemployment was unbelievably high in industry. During this period, there was an increasing focus on economic survival. Du Bois abandoned racial integration. Blacks must now focus on organizing for economic survival by building an independent, cooperative economy in their segregated communities and gain control of their schools. For Indians or Native Americans, the New Deal also brought some significant shifts. On the first hand, there was no longer any forced assimilation to white culture. Indians now were given more cultural autonomy. The Indian Reorganization Act had ended the policy of dividing Indian lands for each family and selling off the rest. It allowed greater cultural autonomy and self-governance. It ended the policy of forced assimilation via boarding schools. Children were no longer taken from parents and educated in white schools. And there was funding for Indian health. But there were limits. The reservations were still centers of deep poverty, and Indian rights were not always recognized. For instance, when the Grand Coulee Dam was built and it flooded Indian lands, those rights to those lands were ignored. For Mexicans, the New Deal and the era of the Depression also had some troubling consequences. There was a decline in the demand for their labor. And as such, 20% of Mexicans in the southwest of the United States left for Mexico, either voluntarily or by coercion. Half of these people who left may have been children born in the U.S. and thus were citizens. They were also excluded from New Deal benefits. As mentioned, the Social Security did not include agricultural labor, and most Mexican Americans or Mexicans were working in agriculture. Again, the Wagner Act did not apply to agricultural workers, and many unions were brutally suppressed amongst Mexican American workers. Further limits on the New Deal were things like federal housing continued a policy of segregation. Housing and mortgages would be funded or insured based on local demands that housing remain segregated. And federal funding would be canceled in a predominantly white neighborhood if even one black family moved into a block. Most blacks in federal government remained at low-level positions, and New Deal construction projects in the South never hired blacks. But in the midst of all of these challenges of the New Deal, there was also some other changes that were more positive. For instance, Americanism was starting to become defined as more inclusive, more protective of individual liberties, and not as much as it used to be, which was a focus on all new people conforming to a specific, predominantly white, predominantly middle class, predominantly Protestant culture. During the New Deal, recent immigrants, people of various ethnic backgrounds, were more formally incorporated into America. Jews and Catholics were appointed to FDR's government. Ethnic workers were heavily courted with works projects, dams, schools, bridges, etc., and they increasingly voted for FDR and the Democrats. And the New Deal embraced cultural pluralism, where one could be American and keep their ethnic individuality, which was different from various previous Americanization attempts. During the New Deal, the American left also increased in prominence and strength. Progressive movements that were crushed in the 1920s were now given both support by the government in terms of unions, or certainly were felt encouraged by a new progressive political atmosphere. Communists, socialists, labor radicals in the CIO, New Deal liberals were all growing in strength and popularity. The Communist Party, for instance, their membership grew to 100,000. The communist impact on political culture was huge. Many sympathized with communism because, since communism was anti-capitalism and the Great Depression had shown how capitalism could fail and lead to a huge depression, Many turned to the Communist Party, both as formal members or looking to them for guidance. The Communist Party was incredibly active. They organized demonstrations for the unemployed. They advocated for the integration of unions for blacks and whites. They pushed civil rights for blacks, and they pushed generally for civil liberties. They were not solely concerned with attacking capitalism. But more generally, there was an increased appeal of the left throughout the Popular Front. Left-wing parties of movements came together and pushed for social reform. They pushed for social and economic radicalism, significant change in the government's ability to provide social and economic freedom and equality. They pushed for economic and racial diversity. They pushed for unionization. What they were arguing against was the old idea of Americanism as the individual pursuit of wealth, and white Protestants being the determinants of American civilization. They were pushing for racial, ethnic, religious diversity as the definers of the new America. Most importantly, they pushed for full racial equality across the board. And to put truth into their words, action into their words, the communists were the ones who defended 9 Scottsboro, Alabama black men accused of raping 2 white women. They raised funds for their defense. They brought international exposure to this trial. And ultimately, the Supreme Court overturned the first 2 convictions of these men. And this court case helped establish a civil liberties precedent that people had a right to effective counsel, and the states cannot bar blacks from juries simply for reasons of race. During the Great Depression and in the New Deal, there was a growing commitment to civil liberties as part of the new America. The American Civil Liberties Union, for instance, shifted from protecting individuals from government to protecting individuals from corporations, such as upholding the right to strike. Senator Robert M. La Follette, Jr. created a committee that exposed the vicious attacks on labor organizers in America. The Department of Justice's Civil Liberties Unit was created, and for the first time, the government was committed to investigating civil rights violations. Now, also, Supreme Court decisions were now routinely overturning laws that infringed on civil liberties, whereas before, the courts would protect liberty of contract, specifically that unions were not allowed to be formed. By the end of the 1930s, there was a rising chorus against the left and the New Deal, and they wanted it stopped. In 1938, the House Un-American Affairs Committee was created to investigate disloyalty, because there was a fear that there was too many communists and extreme socialists and radicals within the New Deal and within the Democratic Party. In 1940, the Smith Act was passed, which outlawed the teaching or encouraging of how to overthrow the government. In New York State, the Rapp-Coudert Committee in the legislature investigated disloyalty, dismissing 60 public university professors for left-wing views. By the end of the 1930s, the end of the New Deal was in sight. There was a lot of opposition from Southern Democrats. They were increasingly alarmed over the possibility of blacks joining unions and getting racial equality in general in the New Deal. What made them so upset in the South? The 1938 Federal Report on Economic Conditions in the South highlighted how economically backward the South was, as well as in education and public health. Southern reformers, labor radicals, black activists were getting stronger. They had organized the Southern Conference for Human Welfare. And in 1938, FDR campaigned aggressively to liberalize the Southern Democratic Party, encouraging congressional voters to send more liberal Southerners to D.C. As a consequence, there was a consolidation of Southern Democratic and Northern Republican opposition to the New Deal. Northerners were turning to the Republicans in 1938. They were frightened by Roosevelt's court-packing scheme, his failure to completely recover the economy, and the increasing radicalism of the CIO. This led to the aforementioned alliance of Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats in Congress against any further New Deal legislation. This was just as well, because by the end of the 1930s, Roosevelt was now focusing increasingly on foreign affairs.